Yaniv here. Thank you so much for joining us. Today we have the distinct pleasure of sitting with Tzvi Shapiro, partner at First Israel Mortgage and a really close personal friend of mine, somebody that I actually went to YU with. We go way back, and we had the honor of doing many wonderful deals together. So we're going to talk today about mortgages, and what we're really going to do is we're going to go into a lot of those questions that we get from first-time buyers here in Israel who don't really know how the system works.
Even repeat buyers, because the system keeps changing. So, as things change, you need to keep up to date.
Why don't we jump right in? How much money can one really borrow from a bank here when purchasing a home in Israel?
So, like a lot of things in Israel, it depends. It's based on one's residency as opposed to where they have citizenship. If someone is a resident of Israel, meaning they live in Israel even if they have not yet made Aliyah, and it is their first time purchasing a property, they could borrow up to 75%, which surprisingly means that if you're an Israeli holding a Teudat Zut but you live in America or elsewhere, you're not necessarily entitled to borrow up to 75% like a non-Israeli who lives in Israel would. And again, that's on a first-time buyer. Someone who owns a property and who has no intention of selling that property in the near future would be limited to 50% as a mortgage. There are situations where one could borrow an additional up to 10% really to cover closing costs as an unsecured loan, but that's not considered a mortgage.
Okay, so somebody coming from the U.S., for example, who wants to purchase a home here and spend 6 months out of the year of vacations, they can borrow 50%.
They could borrow 50%, assuming that the mortgage and the title and the property is on their name. It is perfectly legal to purchase a property in the name of someone else. So if someone has a child who lives in Israel, for instance, over the age of 18, they can structure the deal so that the title is on their child's name and they're just the borrowers. They're qualifying with their income. In that situation, one can obtain, again, up to 70 or 75%.
What would you say are the current interest rates today?
You do have fixed rates that range anywhere from 5 up to 30-year terms. You have variable rates that are obviously going to be much cheaper than fixed rates. End of the range, or the cheapest money, is on the variable rates, where it can be as low as 0.8 or 0.9%. There are limits to how much one can take on that product, and that's on a floating rate in shekels. They're fixed rate in shekels up to 30 years, which today, depending on the loan to value, the amount that you're borrowing, can be as high as 4.5%. If you have a very strong borrower or the loan to value is less than 70%, those rates could be as low as 3.5% or 3.6%. So there's a very wide range, and it really depends on the type of deal that we're dealing with, the type of borrowers that we're dealing with.
So those are quite attractive rates.
Relative to the U.S., I think they're very competitive, yeah.
Can I take a mortgage from my bank in the U.S.?
The answer is no. There are no banks that we know of outside of Israel that lend in Israel. That being said, there are situations where if someone has equity in a property in the States, for example, it may be beneficial for them to take financing there as opposed to in Israel. A good example of this would be in a situation where someone is 60 or 65 years old and they're looking for a 30-year fixed in dollars as a product that doesn't exist in Israel. Furthermore, banks in Israel do discriminate based on age.
So here's something that actually comes up a lot, and it's actually come up now with a particular buyer who's purchasing a property not far from here. They wanted to know if they could sign a contract contingent on obtaining the mortgage. In other words, the bank doesn't just give financing based on the financial ability of the borrower, but they also have to appraise the property. So can I sign a contract here basically contingent upon that bank sending an appraiser and appraising the property for the amount that I need to borrow?
The answer is yes, you can sign a contract like that, but the problem is that in Israel it's not the norm. I've had a few situations where sellers agreed to mortgage contingencies where basically in the event that the borrower was not able to get a mortgage, that the contract was canceled, but it's very rare. So because of that, it makes sense to start a little bit earlier if possible on the mortgage process, getting a pre-approval, getting an appraisal done, getting an engineering report done, etc. Because as you know, most properties are sold as is. It's on the responsibility of the buyer to do any diligence that they need to do, and that includes engineering, financing aspects, etc.
Have you had situations where somebody signed on a contract, got pre-approved, and now the bank, for whatever reason, is not appraising the property?
Not appraising the property. I mean, yes, we had an interesting deal one time where the borrower was very strong. He found a Mitzia, found an amazing property, signed on the contract, but and I think we even got him approved for the pre-approved for the financing, contingent on an appraisal, but he didn't want to wait for the appraisal because he was afraid of losing the deal. What ended up happening was that there was a serious problem title issue with this property where it was unclear. It was known from the examining the title that one of the neighbors definitely had a piece of this person's property. It was unclear which piece that was, if it was just a corner of the backyard or if it was smack in the middle of his kitchen. And because of that, the bank almost did not fund this deal, and it was a very big push on our end to get it done. It did get done in the end, but it just highlights the point where it really does make sense to protect yourself and to get an appraisal and any other diligence you need to do before signing.
Before signing, absolutely. I'm a big proponent of that as well, especially in properties that you know that there's some sort of, balcony enclosure, some sort of infraction that could potentially jeopardize the deal. What do you need from me in order to file for a mortgage?
Standard documentation is 2 years tax returns, 3 months bank statements, IDs, passport and driver's license. Depending on the time of year, we may also need, if it's later in the year, we may need like an accountant's letter estimating net income, credit report, and score. There are also situations where banks will ask questions. So for instance, if someone has losses on their tax returns, net carryover losses from a previous year, the bank will want to understand the nature of those losses. If they have depreciation, amortization, they want to understand what those are from, what those write-offs are from. Yeah.
And are there other lending bodies other than banks that operate in this country in giving loans, especially like to foreign buyers?
There are, less so to foreign buyers, but there are. Similar to how it works in the States, though, it's kind of a last resort unless it's either a very large deal, very large being over 50, 60 million shekels. Then there's like private kranot, private funds that do lend out money, but you're looking at anywhere from 8 to 12%.
Do you ever deal with situations where the buyer gets a personal loan from the seller? I've had that actually posed to me, and it was very new to me. I understand that in like the U.S.
It's common, it's common in the U.S. Not common, but it's done in the U.S. Seller financing. In Israel, not really. What people do sometimes is they structure the contract where it'll be spread out over a year or 2 years, just to make an agreeable payment structure. Having a situation where you're going to be transferring baalut, ownership, from seller to buyer, and then recording a mortgage on the name of the seller is very rare.
Which bank would you say is the best for
all of
mortgages?
them. They're all the best,
and they're
all the worst. There are banks that have really just great rates on fixed rate products, but they have no flexibility in terms of when the mortgage will end. So like they want a hard stop at 75 years old. So if someone's 66, it'll be a 9-year term. There's like no flexibility on this. Some banks don't have great rates necessarily, but they're very flexible in terms of providing waivers on life insurance. By the way, that's something that most American borrowers are not very familiar with. In Israel, to begin with, every bank wants a life insurance policy naming the bank as the beneficiary. For someone who is 40 and up, it starts getting much more expensive, obviously. Someone who's a young buyer, 25, 30 years old, it's okay.
And final question, why go to you? Why would I go and use a mortgage broker if I could just walk into a bank? A lot of these banks now have English-speaking clerks there or whatever. Why would I go to a mortgage broker?
In Israel, as opposed to in other countries, there's zero transparency in terms of rates, zero transparency in terms of requirements, in terms of flexibility on issues like life insurance and things like of that nature. If you go to Google right now and type in mortgage rates in Israel, I think we're the only site that actually posts rates currently available in Israel, and that's not by accident, it's on purpose. Israeli banks are they're in business to make money, and the norm is not to have a transparent marketplace. So the reason you'd want to take on a mortgage broker is really to represent your interests. That goes in terms of the small print, in terms of rates, also in terms of leveraging that relationship that we have with the banks in order to protect you. In Israel, there's a lot of hands-on work that goes into the process. Oftentimes there's negotiations that take place between the seller's attorney and the bank, which we facilitate and which we smooth out and make sure that it gets done quickly and efficiently.
I can definitely attest to that. Yeah.
There's original documentation, and it's not like you could just send copies of payoff letters or anything like that. In Israel, everything has to be original. We facilitate the transfer of documents to and from. It's more than just bussing documents around. People make mistakes. Title office makes mistakes. Banks make mistakes. Lawyers make mistakes. Our job is to review documentation, make sure that the buyer doesn't find himself in a situation where he's, heaven forbid, late, in breach of contract, and all the problems that go with that. So that's our role. That's what we do.
Well, it's very clear to me, and it's definitely very clear to all of the clients that we've had in common thus far. Thank you so much for this.
Thank
I
you.
really appreciate it, and it's great to see you, buddy.